Hi, my name is Chris and this is Battle Nonsense. Today we will take a look at the netcode and servers of Rising Storm 2 Vietnam from Tripwire Interactive, which offers hardcore teamwork-focused battles with up to 64 players. But first we must talk about a few networking basics which you need to know to understand the results of my tests. The reason why I always include this basic information on YouTube while my patrons can get a cut-to-the-chase version on Vimeo is that on YouTube I must consider that these videos attract new viewers who have never seen such a netcode analysis before, and so they might not know what I mean when I talk about tick rates, update rates or latency. In the past I did not include that basic information in every video. Instead I told my audience to please go to another video first, which did provide that information. Sadly, the comments on these videos and the YouTube analytics showed that no one followed this advice, and as a result many people were either confused by my test results or they just misinterpreted them. So, since I'm only doing these videos to help players to get a better understanding of networking in video games, I decided to always include this basic information when I test a new game or when it's been a long time since the last one. This is really the only way how I can ensure that someone who is new to this gets all the required information. But I didn't forget about those of you who already know the networking basics, so if you don't want to refresh your memory, then you can skip that part of the video with the timecode link that you find in the description down below, as well as in the pinned comment of this video. So let's dive into the networking basics then, where we will start with the ping. Now, what is that and where does the term come from? If you've seen the movie The Hunt for Red October, then you might remember that scene where Sean Connery gave the order to use a single active sonar ping to re-verify their range to the target. The way this works is that your ship or submarine sends out an audio signal, which then gets reflected by other objects in the water. This reflection is then received by microphones or hydrophones installed on your ship, and that then allows you to determine the distance between you and that object by measuring the time between sending the audio signal and receiving the reflection. So when we talk about network connections, then the ping between different devices is pretty much the same thing. Your device sends an ICMP echo request to another network device like a game server, which then sends an ICMP echo reply back to your device. When we then measure the time between sending the request and receiving the answer, then we get the ping or round-trip time of the data. So the ping tells us how long data has to travel through the copper and fiber optic cables to reach the other device. And the longer it takes data to reach its destination, the greater the difference between what we see on our monitor and what the other players see on theirs, which is what we call lag. So when I jump, then it takes some time until that information reaches the server and then the other client. With short distances and good routing between the players and the server, this delay or lag is very low. However, the bigger the distance between the clients and the server, the longer it will take until these receive an update on what is happening. So the higher your ping, the more you will lag, which means that you have a bad experience. But it's not just the player with the high ping that suffers. Depending on how strong the lag compensation is in a game, the player with the high ping can also degrade the experience of players who have a low ping, as these then either receive damage far behind cover or get shot before they can even see the player with the high ping. Developers have tried many different solutions to fix or at least mitigate this issue. Some have tried to use a region lock, but that does not work, as network congestion can cause your ping to go from a stable 20 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds at any time. So what can be done? The brute force solution is to disconnect players who have a ping high enough to cause that issue. However, that will hurt your sales and communities which have members across the globe. DICE uses a quite interesting approach to attack this issue in Battlefield 1, which I want to show you now. Here we have a player with a ping of about 47 milliseconds, let's call him player 1. And then we got the shooter, player 2, who has a ping of about 147 milliseconds. When player 2 now fires at player 1, then the client of player 2 will run the hit registration, which figures out that player 1 has been hit. The client of player 2 then sends this information to the server, which runs its own check to confirm the hit. When the server agrees, then it sends the hit confirmation back to player 2 and the damage data to player 1. This form of hit registration is called client-side server authoritative, because while the client does the hit registration, the server must still confirm the hit or no damage will be dealt. When I then slightly increase the ping of player 2 to about 157 milliseconds, then player 2 gets the aim lead indicator, which tells him that his ping to the server is too high. When player 2 now fires at player 1 again, then the hit will not register anymore, because the hit registration now changed from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side. But when player 2 then leads his shot, which means that he just has to fire a little bit earlier, then the shot registers again. This allows player 2 to still hit other players while not making the issue of receiving damage behind cover worse. So once the ping of player 2 is higher than the configured threshold, his hit registration switches from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side, where the server won't compensate for the delay of player 2. This means that the only perspective that now matters is the one from the server, and where he sees player 1 when it receives the information about the shot that player 2 fired. This is how DICE tries to mitigate the issue where players with low pings die far behind cover, while still allowing players from all over the world to come together and play their game. Now, what affects your ping to the game server or your lag in general? One factor that you already know of is the distance between you and the game server. However, it is not possible to determine your ping by taking a map and drawing a straight line between your home and the location where the server is hosted. Because the copper and fiber optic cables take a very different route, and the data that you send to the server has to pass through multiple routers before it reaches the server. So when a router has to forward data, then it tries to use the best route. This means that when everything works as it should, then your data should take the shortest route to the game server. However, it can happen that a router either chooses a bad route or that it has to choose a worse one when the better one is down. Such can then lead to quite big detours for your data, which can also result in much higher pings and an increased risk of packet loss, since your data might have to pass through many more routers then. So when you suddenly notice a much higher ping to your favorite server, then this could be caused by the routing. In this case, you will then have to call your internet service provider so that they can check their routing tables. If you want to get the issue fixed faster, then you can provide them with traceroute data for that server. For that, you open the command prompt, type in traceroute and the IP of the game server that you have problems with. You will then get a list of all the hops between you and the game server with the ping between you and each of these hops. However, please be aware that depending on its configuration, a hop might not reply to your ICMP echo request or with a greater delay. The same is true for game servers where many do not reply when you try to ping them from the command prompt. So the length of the route that connects the client to the server and the amount of hops between them affects how long it takes data to reach its destination. This means that the lag that we experience in a game can never be lower than the travel time of the data, unless we figure out a way to break the laws of physics to speed up the electrons or photons that are used for the communication between the client and the server. What adds an extra delay on top of the travel time of our data is how frequently we send and receive it. So when we send and receive 30 updates per second, then there is more time between updates than when we send and receive 60. So by sending and receiving more updates per second, you can decrease the additional delay that is added on top of the travel time of your data. But where is that data coming from? This is where the term tick or simulation rate comes into play, which is how many times per second the game processes and produces data. So when you have a tick or simulation rate of 60, then this will cause less delay than when you use a tick rate of 30. A tick rate of 60 will also allow the server to send 60 updates per second. But not only the number of simulations that are done per second is important. It's also critical that the server finishes a tick as fast as possible, because at a tick rate of 60 Hz it only has a processing window of 16.66 milliseconds, inside which it must finish a simulation step. So at the beginning of a new tick, the server starts to process the data it received and runs its simulations. After that, it then sends the results to the clients and then sleeps until the next tick happens. The faster the server finishes a tick, the earlier the clients will receive new data from the server, which reduces the delays between players and makes the hit registration feel more responsive. This is something that I showed in my Battlefield 4 tests, where the net graph displays the time the server needs to finish a tick. So when it comes to the server's performance, then it's imperative that it finishes a simulation step as fast as possible, or at least inside the processing window that is given by the tick rate. When it gets close to that limit or even fails to process a tick inside that time frame, then you will instantly notice this, as that results in all sorts of strange gameplay issues like rubber banding, players teleporting, hits getting rejected, physics failing, etc. Now, what kind of options do developers have when it comes to the network model? One solution is that you pay hosters to set up dedicated servers for your games in their data centers, to which the players then connect to. This means that your game server is running on powerful hardware and the data center has enough bandwidth to handle all those players that connect to it. Also, when the matchmaking makes sure that all players have more or less the same ping to the game server, then you can avoid that some players have an unfair advantage in some situations, or give players with low pings a bad experience. The downside of dedicated servers is that if you don't have a game that builds around the idea of the community running these servers, then the publisher or studio has to pay for them, and they are quite expensive. Another challenge is that if you release your game worldwide, then you must also make sure that all players who buy the game have access to low latency servers. If you do not do that, then you create many players with high pings, and that is a problem for your entire community, not just the players who don't have servers near them. A different approach, which many people falsely refer to as peer-to-peer, is that you simply use the PC or console of one of the players to host the game, which means that he essentially becomes the server. With this solution, the game studio does not have to pay for expensive dedicated servers, and it also allows players located in a remote region to play with their friends at relatively low latency. One of the many downsides that this network model is suffering from is that the player who is also the server gets an advantage, because he has zero lag. This causes that he will see you before you see him, and he can fire at you before you can fire at him. Then we also have the problem that all players connect to the host through his consumer-grade internet connection, when in the worst case he could even use Wi-Fi. This frequently results in a lot of lag, packet loss, rubber banding, and an unreliable hit registration. But the most infuriating part of such a client-hosted match is the host migration, which is the process where the whole game pauses for several seconds while a different player is elected to replace the host that just left. Then we got the peer-to-peer network model, which you mostly see in 1v1 fighting games, but there are also a few other multiplayer games that have more than 2 players which use peer-to-peer. And since there are different variations of this network model, I will use For Honor as reference in this explanation. So in this network model we do not have a dedicated game server, nor is a client elected to host the match and run the simulation. However, we at least need a session host which takes care of invites and handshakes. That could be done by a dedicated server, or like in For Honor, a client is used for that task, which is also why the game will pause for several seconds until a new session host has been elected should the previous one leave. Another downside is that because every client runs its own simulation, the responsiveness of the hit registration might also vary depending on the ping of the player you engage. So when you fight a player to which you have a ping of 5 milliseconds, then the hit registration might feel better than when you engage a player to which you have a ping of 148 milliseconds. Or players with a high ping make the hit registration less responsive in general, as the clients keep their simulation in sync. Probably the biggest downside of this network model is security, as every game client knows and sees the WAN IP addresses of the other players. Besides that, there are a few other concerns that this peer-to-peer network model has in common with client-hosted matches, like the impact of underpowered hardware used by the players, as well as the players' consumer-grade internet connection, as all clients talk to each other to keep their simulation in sync. And anti-cheat is also always a very big concern in games that do not have an authoritative game server. So even though dedicated game servers do not magically provide 100% lag-free connections, I believe that they offer the best possible experience in online multiplayer games where you have more than 2 players participating in a match. Now, before I show you the results of my tests, I want to explain how I measure the delay that 2 players are affected by in a multiplayer game. To test this, I use a high-speed camera, 2 PCs where each of them has its own fiber internet connection, and a 144Hz gaming monitor on which the game runs at more than 144 FPS with all graphic options set to the lowest value. To measure the delays between the players, I point my high-speed camera at the monitors and then have player 2 shoot 20 times at player 1. Inside the high-speed recording, I then look for the frame where I see that player 2 starts to fire, and then I count the frames until I see that the damage was received by player 1, which is indicated by either blood splatter, a damage indicator, or the update of the health indicator, depending on what happens first and what is available in the game. In addition to this damage delay test, I also check the delay of the gunfire animation, as well as the movement delay. Now let's talk about Rising Storm 2 Vietnam. It surely does not come as a surprise that it uses the dedicated server network model. However, unlike other studios which moved away from third-party hosters and so decreased the amount of locations that you can rent a server in, as well as reduced how much control a community has over the servers it pays for, Tripwire Interactive does not only allow players to choose from different game server hosters like Multiplay, you can even download the server files to host an online or LAN server yourself. Now, what is the default tick rate of these dedicated servers? This is actually quite easy to find out, because we just need to take a look inside the server's configuration file, where the net server max tick rate value shows as a default of 20, while the default for the LAN server max tick rate is 35. This means that when you set your server type to Internet server, then it will run at 20 ticks. And when you run it in your LAN with the server type set to LAN server, then it will use a tick rate of 35. However, when you have your own server, then you can simply change that value to 60 in the configuration, like I did for one of my Netcode performance tests. Now, how about the update rates? With the default tick rate of 20, Wireshark shows that the server sends 20 updates per second to the client, and the client sends 75 updates per second to the server. When I increase the tick rate to 60, then the rate at which data is sent by the server increases from 20 to 60, while the client still sends 75 updates per second to the server. The following is also quite interesting. When I use the command prompt to ping my game server, then I get about 25 to 26 milliseconds. However, at a tick rate of 20, the scoreboard shows me a ping of 32 milliseconds. But when I increase the tick rate to 60, then my ping in the scoreboard decreases to 28 milliseconds. This shows that the value that we see inside the scoreboard is not the result of an ICMP echo request. It has to include at least some of the processing delays. Now, what does that mean for the delay that two players experience when they play on the same server at a ping of 25 milliseconds? With the default tick rate of 20, I measured an average delay of 60 milliseconds for the damage data, 61.5 milliseconds for the gunfire data, and 64 milliseconds for the movement data. When I then increased the tick rate from 20 to 60, then I measured an average of 42.5 milliseconds for the damage data, 45 milliseconds for the gunfire data, and 48 milliseconds for the movement data. Per default, Rising Storm 2 uses a client-side hit detection, which means the client figures out if you hit something or not. However, the admin of the server can also force the game to use a fully server-side hit detection, which has a quite big impact on the issue of receiving damage behind cover, but it does not affect the delay between two players, as you can see here. When we then compare these results to those from other games, then Rising Storm 2 Vietnam is doing quite well. However, you should not overrate the quite low delay numbers that are measured with the default tick rate of 20, because what these numbers do not tell you is that the low rate of 20 simulations per second and so the 20 updates per second that the server sends to the clients do not leave much room for error or inbound packet loss on the player's end. A tick rate of 60 is definitely preferred, as it not only reduces the delay but also makes the gameplay experience smoother, and the lost packet every now and then is less of an issue. That said, if you run your own server and now consider increasing the tick rate, you must be careful when you try that, because it will have a quite big impact on the CPU load and memory usage of the server, especially at 64 players. Now, how about the issue where players with low pings receive damage very far behind cover? With the hit detection setting at its default, which means that it uses a client-side hit registration, a player with a ping of more than 500 milliseconds can easily hit other players who then receive that shot very far behind cover, as you can see in this example here. However, when the admin chooses to use the server-side hit registration, then the shot will already fail to register at a ping of 228 milliseconds in the same example. So to hit that player, the shooter now has to lead his shot and fire a bit earlier to compensate for the delay caused by his ping of 250 milliseconds. This is similar to how the hit registration works in Battlefield 1 now. However, in Battlefield 1 the game automatically switches the hit registration for just that player from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side once the player's ping exceeds the threshold set by the developers. While in Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, only the admin can change the hit detection from client-side to server-side, which then affects all players who join that server, not just the ones who have a high ping. So I hope that you enjoyed this first netcode analysis of Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, and if you like this kind of niche content where I take a look at the inner workings of video games and show you how these affect your experience, then you can help me to cover the costs of this channel by supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Also, if you want to stay up to date on what I'm currently working on, then you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook. The links are also in the description of this video. And if you don't want to miss the next one, then you might want to subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon below this video to receive a notification when I upload the next one. So if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, subscribe for more, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, have a nice day and take care. My name is Chris and this was Battle Nonsense.